Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Nir Shafir and we are going to be having another lesson about Middle Eastern history, except this time we're going to be speaking about the start of the slave armies in the new capital of Samarra under the Abbasids. Now, having an army of slaves sounds weird, sounds like something out of a fantasy novel today, but it was actually pretty common back in the day, especially in the Middle East and perhaps in other polities. And it solved a basic problem, which is how do you find reliable troops? Not in the sense you need troops that will do whatever you want whenever you want. That's our image of a slave, right? Someone who cannot resist, who has to do what you say. No, the problem is that when you have troops, they're usually from a locality. And this was always the problem with the previous caliphs, right? So the Umayyads had the basis of their troops in Damascus and Syria. And then those troops had kind of other loyalties. They split up into warring factions, etc. And they became ultimately unreliable and they fell because of that. Whereas the power base of the Abbasids was Khorasan. And because Khorasan was somewhat far away from Baghdad, of course, much closer than Damascus or Medina, it was hard to control there. And in fact, the general who started their revolt, Abu Muslim, refused to essentially follow orders, was too independent. They needed someone, a form of troops that didn't have local ties. They didn't have affiliations or loyalties to other power holders in the region, to families, etc., to tribes. And in fact, that was the idea of slavery. Now it starts off with this Caliph Al-Mu'tasim, who rules 833 to 842 after Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun's the famous guy who started, exploring the pyramids. He started the Mehna, did a whole variety of different stuff. And he basically, as a prince, starts buying slaves in Baghdad at the slave market, specifically Central Asian slaves. Why Central Asians? Because they're coming from these Turkic tribes out on the border regions. They know how to ride horses. They know probably archery and how to fight. And there he picks up some of his top commanders, a guy named Itah and also another one named Ashinas. And he builds from there a private army with his money of 3,000 to 4,000 slaves. And the main point here is that they don't have local allegiances, because that's the entire point of a slave. A slave is, ideally, one definition of slavery is not that their people are owned, but people who have suffered a social death, that they have no connections to the community around them, such as family or other forms of connectivity. So that's in that sense, those slaves are dependent on you, the master, or the master, and therefore become better and more efficient people in the army, and can be trained to be kind of fighting warriors as well. And so these military slaves almost all came from, at this point, Central Asia. That was the frontier with the Abbasid realm. Another point, of course, is that technically under Islamic law, you're not supposed to be taking slaves from within the lands of Islam, of the empire. Instead, slaves are always taken from the Dar al-Harb, the realm of war, that is the spaces, the non-Islamic spaces. And so Central Asia was one of those. And they wanted those non-Islamized Turks. Often they're picking up boys, teenage boys, training them heavily, helping develop their skills in horseback archery. It's actually really hard, one, to shoot a bow, and second, to shoot a bow on a horse. In fact, even shooting a gun on a horse was almost impossible until the 19th century. So getting that skill, being able to have mounted archers was kind of the high point of military technology back then. And that is what they were trying to create. Basically, not these large masses of armies like the Khorasan Corps that were the core of the Abbasid armies, which had 50,000, 60,000 people. They wanted small elite units. These are the sort of Navy SEALs, if you were, or Army Rangers of the army, which you have basically a few thousand of. Now, The problem with military slaves, though, is that they're just really expensive. One, you have to buy them. But more than that, then you have to raise them, you have to train them, you have to pay them a salary because they're bought, but then you still have to pay them because otherwise they'll just go away. And they have to be paid a high salary because they're very highly trained troops and have special skills. They need to have horses, they have to have clothes, they get a bunch of other fringe benefits. And the other problem is that they're just really unruly. Like they basically saw themselves as the Sultan's the Caliph's special guard. And they just refused to follow orders. They would march, basically ride their horses through Baghdad, knocking over people. They didn't speak Arabic well, if at all. Instead, they spoke their Turkic language. People saw them as weird and bizarre and poorly trained, and so they were being attacked every once in a while by the population of Baghdad, who really didn't like these guys marching through, pretending they owned everything and not even being able to speak to anyone. And then on top of that, there was a question: how do you actually pay for these guys now that they're so expensive? The solution to both of these problems was to create another capital out in the middle of the desert called Samarra. Samarra today is a city in Iraq, and it actually has some remaining pieces of that palace built out, which you can see here. You have the mosque and minaret of Samarra in this famous ziggurat form. I've never seen it myself, but I've always wanted to go and check it out. And you can actually still go and kind of get a sense of the layout of the walled city and how it was supposed to look like. Now, Samarra was essentially a city built just as a now administrative capital, because Baghdad was also built as as the new city, the center of this empire, etc. But at this point, it became gigantic. It was like 500,000, 1 million people, which was huge for the non-modern world. And it was specifically just a place for the caliph, his palace, and his troops. Keep everyone else out there, keep the troops unadulterated from the local society. And it never really develops into a big city like Baghdad. Baghdad remains the cultural capital, the intellectual capital, the religious capital. It becomes the center of everything, where Samarra basically was just a kind of an administrative hub. The other reason why they built a new city in Samarra, the reason why it would create ways of paying people, is like Baghdad, a lot of this was also real estate speculation. The idea is that you create a new city, then people have to move there. You give your top commanders plots of land, which they develop and then sell off, getting rich. So in that sense, all of this is a way of paying off these people and paying off these soldiers with land and buildings. Now, the other problem, though, is that in this administrative city, you basically have the palace, some administrators, and then you have a whole bunch, 4,000 elite soldiers who the caliph is who are supposed to follow the caliph. But it turns out it's actually the other way. Now the caliph is so isolated, he has no one else to rely upon. And he's basically left to the mercy of these soldiers, who actually do not refuse, as unlike what we would imagine slaves to do, rebel, refuse to do what they say, and they actually end up assassinating the caliph and bringing in the next guy in line for succession. And that's actually what happens with Al-Mutawakkil. He gets killed by the Turkish slave soldiers. And what ends up happening is basically dynastic anarchy for the Abbasids in the years 861 to 870. All the caliphs are trapped in Samarra. No one can really escape. No one can also move back to Baghdad because the troops threaten them. And so basically you have 4 caliphs in 9 years. That's about tenure of 2 years per caliph. 2 of them are killed. Everyone is fighting with each other. It's a major disaster. Eventually the powers get balanced and the caliphs move back to Baghdad. But it was an interesting experiment in slave soldiers, and it's one that continues in the future, because what they really need is essentially a professional army, an army that is not just, for example, the initial army of the Muslims after the Prophet initial conquest of the Muslims. So in the 630s, it was basically tribesmen from Arabia. Those tribesmen, then under the Umayyads, they were relying on tribesmen from Syria province. And then under the Abbasids, they're relying on the tribesmen now settled down, now localized in Khorasan. But now they need people who are not like, they need actual professional army soldiers. And there's ultimately two ways to do it. One way is to basically recruit slave soldiers. The other way, though, is what will end up happening is that often nomads come in who are already trained and are already militarily inclined, take over a state, and then basically bring in nomadic groups to fuel the army. And that sets up the basic dynamics of armies for the next 800, 700 years or so in the Middle East and in much of Central Asia and South Asia. And so what it also means, though, is that the armies are no longer pulling from everyday Muslim subjects. Muslim subjects are now civilianized, right? They're not like the original Arabs moving further on the frontier, and those are the Muslims or the soldiers, and the local population is the settled people who are paying taxes. Instead, the Muslims are the settled people, and now you have an army that is made out of initially non-Muslims. They get manumitted, that is, they're freed and then converted, but you have a separation between the population and the army. Now, one thing to think about, is this a problem? Yes, possibly. Is this a problem in the United States today? Do we have a professional military caste emerging in the United States? Are there specific military families that send their children out to the military? And are those people have greater power today or a specific chokehold on power? I don't know. Think about it, but it's one of those things one lesson we can think about through studied slave soldiers in the army under Abbasid rule. Bye.